Hi there to our A-Level history students. As you can see, this video is going to be related to Unit 3, which is Civil Rights in the USA. And what we're going to think about is Native American civil rights in the Gilded Age period. When we say the Gilded Age period, remember, we mean approximately, so circa, from between the years 1875 to 1895. So when it comes to Native Americans, that principally means about the Dawes Act. This will help you primarily with section A of your exam, which is the evaluation question, because the Gilded Age is one of those periods of time that you could be asked about, and you would have to judge which of the two passages you're given is most convincing about that particular topic for this particular time. Before we get to the Gilded Age though, let's remind ourselves about Native Americans and their position by the 1860s, the start of your course. The Native Americans were not a homogeneous group. They were not one people group. They were split into various different tribes, and you can see some of the approximate locations of these tribes prior to European contact. If you remember, we said that these tribes could often be at war with one another. They might have slightly different cultures, different languages. And so it's tricky to not speak of them as one group, because although we are going to, they weren't. They were separated into different tribes, and these tribes did not show much unity between one another necessarily. By the time our course starts in 1865, European settlers have settled the east coast of America up until the Appalachian Mountains, and they've also started to settle the west coast of America, but they have left the Great Plains of America largely unsettled. That's because it's seen as really inhospitable, and it's not desirable to live there because life would be tough. So the Great Plains, and more particularly the Native Americans who live on the Great Plains, known as the Plains Indians, have been left relatively untouched despite European settlement to North America. However, our key point is this: by the 1960s, the Plains Indians still lived relatively untouched by European immigrants, but our course starts as this begins to change. These Plains Indians lived very different lives to European settlers in terms of their culture, values and practices. They were nomadic, having no fixed abode. They worshipped nature, which they referred to as the Great Spirit, who they believed had bequeathed the land to them to look after. They had their own languages, had their own culture and ceremonies. They had their own tribal laws and tribal governments that were run by tribal chiefs. They believed in polygamy, and so male braves would have several wives. And they followed buffalo herds, hence they were nomadic, and they relied on the buffalo for almost every aspect of their life. Braves, male Plains Indians, demonstrated their skill in hunting in this area. The Plains, as we said, were considered incapable of sustaining life, so these Indians were initially left alone, but soon this was all under threat. So our first question is this: what changes in the years 1860 to 1887? Well, firstly, there is westward expansion. What we mean by this is European immigrants start venturing onto the plains of America looking to settle it. And previously they have not done this. Partly this is because of A belief in manifest destiny, which encouraged settlers onto the plains because they believed that God had given them this land, America, which they would then settle and populate. This is in conflict with this concept of the Great Spirit that the Native Americans held. And B, we also know that in 1862 the Homestead Act was enacted by the US government, and 20,000 white settlers were given land on the plains to encourage people to move there. The impact of this is that some tribes started to make treaties. They handed land to the US government, recognizing that they could not stop this, particularly because the US Army and their weaponry could not be fought against. Many Native Americans started to go hungry and began to starve on these reservations that were created because they were not able to access food as they usually could. And so from 1862 to 1868 there are a series of conflicts known as the Plains Wars between Native Americans and the US Army at this time as these plains are settled. The second big thing that impacts the years 1860 to 87 is the railways. There was always a desire to develop a coast-to-coast network running from the east coast to the west coast of America. In 1869, for instance, the Union Pacific Railway was completed. The impact of this is that rail companies encouraged settlers to the plains to help build these railways. So the land that they were given to lay track on, they also encouraged people to come and live and work there. So more people started to settle the plains where the Plains Indians lived. Secondly, the rail lines disrupted buffalo herds, which means they were difficult to follow. And also the rail lines brought buffalo hunters to the plains, so that the southern and northern buffalo herds are almost completely wiped out by the late 1880s. Therefore, this dependency of the Plains Indians on buffalo herds severely affected their food supplies and their way of life. Two significant violent skirmishes that are worth remembering happened in 1864 and in 1890. In these two instances, at Sand Creek and at Wounded Knee, the US cavalry attacks undefended, starving Native Americans, killing men, women, children and the elderly. In the right-hand picture you can see a mass grave with the soldiers there taking a photo of their kill. The situation of these Plains Indians, therefore, was increasingly dire in the late 19th century. What do the actions of the US government tell us? Well, the key point here is that assimilation was the aim, but the methodology to achieve this does change. The first attempt at assimilation is seen in reservation policy from 1871. Here, the US government has already started this process with the signing of treaties in the 1850s, as mentioned before. These reservations, though, from 1871 were made without consultation. There was no treaties now, they were imposed on Native Americans. And on these reservations, polygamy was banned, herbal remedies were banned, tribal laws were abolished, communal living was ended, and the powers of the tribal chief were also removed. Lastly, Native American children were also sent to off-reservation boarding schools so they could be taught, essentially, white American culture. However, reservation policies does not achieve assimilation because on these reservations Native Americans could flout these laws and they could still live as a community. Therefore, there is a change of policy in 1887. In 1887, the Dawes Severability Act is enacted by the US government. This still wants to achieve assimilation, but the methodology is changing. Here's a drawing of what the Dawes Act looks like. Reservations in random US states where Native American tribes could live were now to be broken up into smaller allotments. Therefore, this is known as allotment policy. Take a moment just to kind of appreciate how these allotments were decided. Pause the video if you need to. The Dawes Act, therefore, divided reservations into allotments, hence the term allotment policy, and this turned Native Americans into landowners and citizens after 25 years. 160 acres were given as farming land per family unit, or 320 acres of grazing land per family unit. Land was to be given to the male head of the family, and any unallotted lands that were left over could now be sold. If you're an orphan or single, you would also get land, but this would be a smaller amount. This was then extended to the 5 civilized tribes of Oklahoma through the Curtis Act in 1898. One of the key impacts of this act is that now Native American lands are going to be gobbled up by white settlers. Let's talk about the impact of the Dawes Act in more detail. The Dawes Act had some severe impacts on Native American tribes, therefore. Firstly, well, life on reservations was already tough because the Native Americans were given land that was poor and difficult to farm. At the same time, government subsidies, so federal aid, was often insufficient and it was often cut when other priorities emerged. So already, Native Americans were in a poor position. Allotments was much the same. Most Native Americans could not adapt to farming, and so their allotments ran into kind of debt or disrepair, and so they had to sell their allotment to white settlers and return to reservations. With this money, for those who sold it, many Native Americans squandered it because money was not a concept they were familiar with. That led them to fall into poverty, and also it led them to fall into addiction as well. So as said, after selling up, they returned to reservations. This was a problem though, because reservations are also much smaller, because land has been allotted to individual families. At the same time, some Native American tribes were matriarchal, so the female was the head of the family. This is true with the Iroquois and the Cheyenne. And so women in those tribes lost their status as their allotments were given to the male head of the family. The culmination, really, of the US government's involvement with Plains Indians is seen in Wounded Knee, therefore, where a member of the Sioux tribe described how a people's dream died there. There was a huge loss of land due to the Dawes Act as well. As you can see here, by 1900, only 78 million acres of land that Native Americans had remained, and that was down from 150 million acres 13 years previously. Not just due to the Dawes Act, but due to Native American policy in general, approximately only 100,000 of the 240,000 Plains Indians actually remained. What we mean by that is they died. Therefore, we can say this: Native Americans, and particularly Plains Indians, were condemned to being a people without an identity and a people who were living in the direst poverty. Take a moment to just read Harold Evans' comments on the Dawes Act from his book The American Century, produced in 1998. The key here is Harold Evans says this: it was ironic that in a democratic society, nobody actually listened to what the Native Americans wanted. There was no involvement of the Native Americans themselves in federal policy. They were to be assimilated despite their wishes and desires. And so, as he says, instead of democracy, they got oppression. Some historians have said that actually the Dawes Act was a step forward because it improved the rights of Native Americans by offering them citizenship. And it also offered them the ability to change to being landowners. Those historians tend to be in a minority. Many see the Dawes Act as a continuation of abuse by the federal government because it was not what the Native Americans wanted, and so either the government were ignoring them or just did not understand them. And even though they did get citizenship after 25 years, it meant little in practice. Many Native Americans didn't understand what that meant and what laws were there to protect them, and many experienced discrimination, particularly in voting. And it's also continuity from what went before, because it just continued this determination to assimilate rather than to self-determine their future. What was the response of Native Americans? Well, the key point here is there was a lack of unity, leadership and resistance from Native Americans. Native Americans, as we said at the start, are tribal in their structure. So they often fought amongst themselves, literally. There was no common language and to an extent no common culture, although there was a generic Native American culture that had links. And therefore, a lack of unity was the byproduct of this. Native Americans were not able to resist easily because they were not a united group. Therefore, there was a lack of strong leadership as well. There was some resistance though. Firstly, in the form of violence. We've mentioned about the Plains Wars of 1862 to 68, and also the famous Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, where General Custer and about 200 of his cavalry unit were killed by a Native American tribe. In fact, it was this event that made many in America realize reservation policy was not working. There was some use of the courts. This is outside the Gilded Age now, but I think it's still relevant. In 1902, the Cherokee challenged Congress's right to deny them their rights, in the case Cherokee versus Hitchcock. And then in 1903, in the case of Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock, Lone Wolf being a Kiowa chief, the Medicine Lodge Treaty terms were challenged because they'd been broken by the government and ignored. It was this decision though, Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock, where Native Americans were described as ignorant and dependent, and the US government were allowed to break treaties legally. In fact, this is what the court actually said in that judgment. Take a moment to read it. The legal argument here was that the Native Americans were so dependent they could not be trusted to look after themselves. And so the federal government had the power to break treaties because they knew what was best for Native Americans rather than Native Americans themselves. This gives you a really clear indication to the attitudes towards Native Americans at the time, particularly of the Supreme Court. The last example of a lack of response or some response to the Dawes Act and the Gilded Age is summed up in this picture. The Constitution of the state of Sequoia, which you can see drawn on a map there next to Oklahoma. In 1905, the Muskogee Convention was held, and this was led by the 5 civilized tribes of Oklahoma. And they proposed creating the state of Sequoia. They wrote a constitution, and at this convention, most of the tribes voted in support of this. Their own state where they could live as they wished. This was rejected by Congress completely, and the Oklahoma Territory and the Indian Territory were combined to form the state of Oklahoma as we know it today. For those 5 civilized tribes, approximately 100,000 families were allotted lands, and about 2 million acres of Indian land was opened up to white settlers again. We've come to the end of our video about Native Americans in the Gilded Age. If you need to, pause the video and have a look at these 10 questions to see if you can remember some of the things we've discussed.